You are inside a burning coastal village at dawn. The clash of steel has faded, but the screams linger like ghosts in the smoke. The air is thick with ash, falling slow and silent, as though the sky itself mourns what is happening below. You crouch in the shadows with other women, trembling behind the half-collapsed wall of your home. Your breath catches in your throat as footsteps crunch over charred timber. Then they find you, men with braided hair, eyes cold as iron, voices sharp in a language you do not know. Rough hands seize your arms, dragging you into the open. Chains bite into your wrists, cutting flesh with every movement. The faces around you are blank, unpitying. And then it hits you with suffocating clarity. You are not being taken to safety. You are being taken as property. Survival will not mean freedom. For centuries, stories have been told of Viking glory, of sleek longships slicing across the seas, of warriors with fearless courage, of sagas filled with gods and heroes. Hollywood has dressed them in romance, wild but noble conquerors, misunderstood men of adventure. Yet buried beneath the sagas and the silver lies a truth far darker, one carved into chronicles and bones. What awaited the women taken in these raids was not the fleeting chaos of battle, but an organized system of dehumanization so brutal that even death sometimes seemed kinder. If this glimpse into forgotten shadows grips you, subscribe and share in the comments where you're watching from. It fuels the uncovering of more histories left to rot in silence. Because the Vikings were not just raiders. They built empires stretching from Ireland to Russia, binding seas with their trade and terror alike. And what movies never show is that the taking of women was not incidental to conquest. It was central to it. This was not random pillage, but systematic exploitation, written into their economies and rituals, remembered in sagas, in the Arab accounts of Ibn Fadlan, in the desperate laments of Christian monks, and in the cold archaeological evidence dug from the earth. These are not myths. They are facts, preserved in ledgers, treaties, and bones. The clash of battle was never the true end. For the Vikings, the real harvest began after the swords fell silent. Villages smoldered, bodies cooled in the grass, and those left breathing, mostly women and children, were pulled into the open. This was not chaos, not some drunken plundering spree. It was the first step in a systematic process honed across centuries, a machine of dehumanization that turned living people into currency. Chroniclers describe how captives were sorted almost immediately, sometimes within the very ruins of their homes. Age, strength, fertility, beauty, all were assessed with cold precision. A young woman clutching her infant might be torn from the child's arms because the ledger placed value on her womb, not her motherhood. An old woman, wrinkled and bent, was often cut down on the spot, her body tossed aside as waste, not worth the iron chain it would take to drag her. This sorting was not hidden. It was performed publicly, deliberately, as a form of psychological warfare. Survivors were forced to witness daughters stripped, inspected like livestock, their worth discussed in crude measurements. Families clung together, only to be ripped apart in front of one another, because the breaking of bonds created the deepest terror. One monk writing of the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 recorded with horror that the virgins of God were seized, their cries swallowed by the sea, implying that nuns were carried off first, their spiritual vows mocked as meaningless beside the axe. Archaeological evidence reinforces these chilling accounts. Shackles dug up from Viking trading towns such as Hedeby and Birka show the marks of standardization. Mass-produced iron collars and chains, designed not for improvisation but for industrial-scale captivity. These were not tools of random cruelty. They were tools of commerce. The captured women were no longer referred to by their names. Instead, they became entries in ledgers and oral accounts, grouped by category. 15 females, aged 16 to 20, in excellent condition. The same phrasing that might describe livestock or a shipment of furs. In Dublin, which became one of the largest Viking slave markets in Europe, archaeologists have uncovered the foundations of pens and warehouses where human beings were held before sale. The annals of Ulster speak of thousands, literally thousands of captives processed in a single season. Ships themselves became floating prisons. The women were forced into the dark holds, chained together, packed shoulder to shoulder in air rank with salt, sweat, and blood. Mortality was expected. Contemporary estimates suggest that losing 15% of captives during transport was considered an acceptable loss, no different than spoiled grain or broken pottery. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab traveler who encountered the Norse along the Volga, wrote with disgust of the way they treated their human cargo, describing women kept for the uses of the crew during voyages, discarded or traded like coin when they reached shore. And yet, behind the brutality lay cold economics. The Viking world thrived on trade, and the slave market was its beating heart. A young woman could fetch more than silver, more than cloth, more even than prized weapons. Commanders received bonuses for the number and quality of captives brought back. Raids were planned with an eye not just to plunder, but to the demographic value of their targets. Fertile river valleys and coastal monasteries were chosen not only for wealth, but for the availability of women. It is easy to imagine raids as storms of chaos, fire, and steel. But the aftermath reveals a different truth. These were harvests, carefully measured, deliberately cultivated. Records show fluctuations in slave prices across regions, with young women at times worth double the value of men. When famine struck in Scandinavia, demand for female captives increased as their labor and reproductive capacity were seen as investments against future scarcity. This systematic exploitation left scars that outlived the victims themselves. In some parts of Europe, folklore records mothers burning their own homes or scarring their daughters' faces to make them less desirable to raiders. Chroniclers in Francia describe entire villages that chose mass suicide over capture. The terror of the Vikings was not only in their swords, but in what they did afterward, what they made others imagine might await them. The erasure of identity was as devastating as the physical violence. Names were stripped away. A Christian woman might be forced into a Norse household, given a new name that mocked her faith, expected to abandon her prayers and bow before strange gods. In later centuries, the process reversed under Christian rulers, with Norse captives baptized against their will. But the machinery was the same: erase the past, overwrite the soul, make the captive forget who they once were. In sagas written centuries later, fragments of this horror surface beneath the romantic gloss. A verse might casually mention a chieftain's concubine, taken from Ireland or the East, her identity erased to nothing more than thrall. The sagas celebrate the warriors, but their women remain voiceless, yet their silence speaks volumes. Behind every banquet scene, every treasure hoard, lay the invisible suffering of captives whose bodies built the wealth of the Viking Age. Pause for a moment and consider the scale. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of women were taken over the course of Viking expansion, from England, Ireland, Francia, the Baltic, even as far as North Africa and the Middle East. To imagine the Viking world without slavery is impossible. Their farms, their households, their trade networks, all were saturated with human lives bought and sold. And at the center of that machine were the women, caught in a nightmare worse than death, their humanity reduced to ledger entries, their futures stolen by a system as cold as it was efficient. But the process did not end at capture or transport. For the Vikings, the true value of women began once they were absorbed into the machinery of their society. What films often sanitize as taking wives was, in reality, a cold spectrum of exploitation, ranging from concubinage in the halls of chieftains to backbreaking labor in the fields and the ever-present threat of being sold again if one failed to please. Chroniclers of Francia complained bitterly of markets where Irish and Anglo-Saxon women were displayed, stripped of dignity, their prices debated openly by Norse traders and foreign buyers alike. The records show how detailed these valuations could be. Youth increased price. Clear skin and good teeth added coin. Women with children were less valuable, not for mercy's sake, but because a child was seen as wasted capacity. It was commerce so ruthless that it blurred every line between intimacy and transaction. What is perhaps most chilling is how systematic the erasure of self became. In Viking households, women taken in raids were renamed, reclothed, and recast into roles that erased their past identities. They became thralls, a word that survives today in English as enthralled, implying both captivity and obsession. This was not only physical subjugation, but psychological warfare, an entire system designed to make them forget who they once were. Pregnancy itself became a ledger entry. Archaeological finds in Scandinavian settlements reveal that some women were deliberately paired with owners or overseers, their children raised not as heirs, but as property extensions of the household. In the sagas, casual references appear to the children of thralls, often noted as lesser, yet still counted as wealth. In other words, the body of the captive woman became both tool and commodity, a renewable resource of human capital. Survivors of this fate, if they lived long enough, might find themselves traded multiple times across different regions. A woman seized in the British Isles might end her life in Kiev, Constantinople, or even Baghdad, transported along the sprawling slave routes of the Viking world. One Frankish bishop noted bitterly that the roads from sea to east are paved with the tears of stolen daughters. These words were not exaggeration. Genetic studies today confirm traces of Scandinavian lineage spread deep into populations once targeted by raids, a living echo of systematic exploitation. For the women themselves, the trauma was relentless. There was no guarantee of stability, no sense of permanence. A thrall could be gifted as a wedding present, gambled away at a feast, or slaughtered as punishment for defiance. The sagas, when they do record such events, mention them with chilling detachment, as if these were no more remarkable than the trading of livestock. And yet, behind the cold efficiency lay human suffering so immense that it reshaped entire societies. In regions frequently targeted, cultural practices emerged in response. Parents scarred their daughters, deliberately burning skin or breaking teeth to make them less attractive to raiders. In Ireland, some communities fled inland, abandoning fertile coastal lands rather than risk the shadow of dragon-headed ships on the horizon. Even centuries later, folk tales whispered warnings of Northmen who would take daughters away forever, a collective trauma embedded in the cultural memory. The Vikings understood the power of this reputation. They did not need to burn every village. Sometimes, the mere whisper of their coming caused entire towns to surrender, handing over their women in exchange for a chance to be spared the sword. This was conquest through fear, amplified by the knowledge of what captivity meant. The weapon was not only the axe, it was the systematic exploitation of women as instruments of terror. Evidence of this system extends even into Viking law codes. Surviving fragments indicate that thralls had no legal personhood. If a woman was assaulted or killed, it was considered not a crime against her, but against her owner, treated the same as damage to a plow or horse. Compensation was measured in silver, not justice. In one particularly stark clause, a man fined for impregnating another man's thrall was ordered to surrender a replacement thrall of equal value, as though human life could be swapped like tools. This bureaucratic precision should unsettle us most. It shows that what modern culture depicts as wild raiders were, in truth, running a system closer to an economy of misery. The raids supplied it, the markets expanded it, the laws preserved it, and women, at every step, were the cornerstone of its function. When we read of Viking settlements, we must understand what that truly means. Towns like Dublin, York, and Novgorod flourished not only because of trade in silver or furs, but because they became hubs of human trafficking. Captured women were the unseen foundation of their growth, their labor shaping households, their wombs producing children who bridged cultures not by choice but by force. Contemporary outsiders noticed. Ibn Fadlan, again, marveled at the cruelty he witnessed. He described the death rituals of Viking chieftains, where slave girls were forced into roles as ritual concubines, culminating in sacrifice. Whether exaggerated or not, the account reflects how normalized such fates had become, so normalized that they were woven into spectacle. Even death could not free these women from exploitation. And yet, centuries later, popular imagination remembers the longships, the feasts, the warrior poets. The women remained shadows, their voices drowned in smoke and sea spray. What makes this history worse than movies show is not only the scale of brutality, but the cold, systematic nature of it. This was not chaos. It was calculation, not madness, but machinery. A system that weaponized intimacy, turned reproduction into arithmetic, and erased entire generations beneath the mask of Viking glory. Pause and reflect on this. Behind every saga of conquest is the silence of countless women whose lives ended in servitude, whose children bore the legacy of chains, whose very existence was catalogued like coin. The true Viking Age cannot be understood without them. And yet, their story is the one least told, the one most buried beneath romance. This is the shadow the sagas left behind, the systematic exploitation of captured women, worse than death, worse than the flames of battle, a system carved into law, economy, and memory. A truth that still chills when we dare to unearth it. By the time the Viking Age reached its height, the taking of women was no longer just a consequence of raids. It had become a deliberate system, a cycle planned, recorded, and perpetuated like any other form of agriculture or trade. What began in smoke and steel ended in ledgers and laws. Raids were no longer mere bursts of violence, but were scheduled with chilling regularity. Spring and summer campaigns targeted fertile coasts and river valleys, chosen not only for plunder, but for the predictable yield of captives. Scouts reported on villages, noting not just defenses or wealth, but the number of women of useful age. Entire expeditions were justified by the promise of human cargo, with longships designed to carry both silver and flesh. And what awaited the captives was not randomness, but structure. Women were divided into categories: concubines for chieftains, laborers for farms, merchandise for markets. In Dublin, York, and Hedeby, records show bustling slave markets that functioned as regional centers, linking Scandinavia to the wider medieval world. Byzantine merchants purchased northern women for their harems. Arab traders transported them along the Volga to the Abbasid Caliphate. Every raid fed into a vast network that transformed villages into human reservoirs for empires. The brutality lay not only in the initial violence, but in the normalization that followed. A woman could be forced to manage other captives, becoming both victim and instrument. Some were ordered to select which girls would be sold and which retained, spreading the cruelty deeper, corrupting bonds between those who might otherwise have been sisters in suffering. The system thrived on breaking spirit as much as body. Even reproduction became a mechanism of profit. Chroniclers hint at the cold calculations of Viking masters. Capturing girls between 12 and 16 increased the likelihood of healthy children, a generational investment that could double the wealth of a household. Archaeological evidence of mixed ancestry across Scandinavia, sudden genetic shifts within a few generations, suggests this was not accidental. It was strategy. Pause and consider this arithmetic. To yield 100 survivors, a raid might capture 1,000 women, knowing most would perish from transport, resistance, or disease. 9 in 10 lost, 1 in 10 retained, and still it was deemed efficient. This was not savagery without thought. It was exploitation measured with precision. At feasts, the cruelty was flaunted. Thralls were paraded before guests, their humiliation woven into entertainment. Some sagas recall mock weddings, where a captive woman was dressed as a bride only to be laughed at, stripped, and reassigned to servitude. For the Vikings, intimacy itself was turned into theater, a stage on which power could be displayed, bonds mocked, humanity erased. By this point, the fear of capture had become so overwhelming that it reshaped entire landscapes. Coastal regions were abandoned. Communities built fortifications, not only against steel, but against the memory of women carried screaming into ships. Parents mutilated their own daughters, breaking bones, scarring skin, anything to make them less desirable in Viking eyes. This was the echo of a reputation so dreadful that the whisper of it alone could topple towns. This is the heart of the horror. The Viking system was not merely violent. It was systematic. A machine that harvested lives, processed them into property, and fed them into an economy that stretched across continents. And women, always women, bore the heaviest weight. The further we peer into this machine, the more chilling it becomes. Because the system did not merely survive on raids, it evolved to sustain itself. Captives born into Viking households became the next generation of thralls. Children of enslaved women were marked at birth as property, their futures predetermined. Some sagas mention them in passing, nameless, voiceless, existing only as footnotes to the wealth of their masters. It was a cycle designed to perpetuate itself without end. Religion, too, was weaponized. Some captives were forced to undergo public rituals mocking their faith, Christian women made to renounce the cross, Eastern women compelled to bow to Norse idols. Later, as Scandinavia converted to Christianity, the rituals reversed, pagan captives baptized against their will. In both cases, the point was not belief, but domination. Faith itself became another tool of control, reshaping souls to fit the system. The legal code stripped away the last remnants of humanity. A thrall woman's suffering was never her own in the eyes of the law. It was an injury to her owner's property. A rape was not a violation of the woman, but a debt owed to the man who claimed her. Some fines were so casually written that they read like instructions for repairing damaged goods. This bureaucratic cruelty is what makes the system truly horrifying. It was not chaos, not bloodlust, but order. Public spectacles deepened the terror. Accounts from Christian clerics describe women forced into humiliations before entire assemblies, mock trials, staged punishments, spectacles that turned personal degradation into communal entertainment. In doing so, the Vikings ensured that domination was not only practiced but celebrated, reinforced as cultural identity. And through this, the normalization set in. For generations of Scandinavians, the presence of thralls in households was as natural as livestock in barns. Children grew up watching their mothers command both kin and captives, never questioning the system. Exploitation became culture. Oppression became tradition. The cycle was complete. What had begun as raids of terror became the accepted rhythm of daily life. Pause and let that sink in. Entire societies were reorganized around the taking of women. Fear shaped villages. Trade routes thrived on their misery. Laws protected their captors. And over centuries, the system became invisible to those who benefited. So ordinary it no longer seemed monstrous. This is why the horrors of Viking captivity were worse than movies show. Films can capture the clash of steel, the burning of villages, the spectacle of ships gliding across the sea. But they rarely capture the quiet machinery of exploitation, the systematic turning of women into currency, the generational cycles of servitude, the normalization of what should never be normal. That is the true legacy, buried beneath sagas of heroes and myths of noble raiders. The climax of this history is not found in battlefields, but in ledgers, in laws, in the chilling arithmetic of a system that treated intimacy as conquest and humanity as merchandise. And it is there, in that cold normalization, that we glimpse the darkest truth of all. When we step back from the ruins and the ledgers, from the screams carried across seas and the silence buried in sagas, one truth lingers: civilizations survive by normalizing the unthinkable. For the Vikings, the captivity of women was not a side effect of conquest. It was its foundation. And in that foundation, we see how power, when unchecked, transforms intimacy into terror, reproduction into arithmetic, and human lives into commodities traded like coin. The echoes have never fully vanished. Across the coasts once terrorized, folklore still whispers warnings of the Northmen. In genetic studies, faint traces of Scandinavian lineage appear in places where Viking longships once landed, silent testimony to unions forged not by choice but by chains. In cultural memory, the dread of abduction shaped legends, laws, and even geography, driving families inland, reshaping the map itself around fear. What Hollywood often paints as a saga of adventure, heroic warriors, glorious ships, proud feasts, was built on the suffering of countless women whose names we will never know. Their stories survive not in the verses of skalds, but in the margins, in chronicles of monks who wrote of daughters stolen, in Arab accounts of markets swollen with human cargo, in the bones unearthed from graves that bear the scars of shackles. These are not fantasies. They are facts preserved with the precision of tax scrolls and trade records. And it is this precision that should haunt us most, because it shows how ordinary people can accept the extraordinary cruelty of their age. To a Viking child, seeing thralls in the household was no more unusual than seeing livestock in the field. To their rulers, capturing women was not a crime, but an economic calculation. To their traders, markets filled with captives were simply another ledger of profit and loss. This normalization of exploitation, this quiet absorption of horror into daily life, is what makes history echo with such unease. If these shadows disturb you, let them serve not only as a window into the past, but as a mirror for the present. For every age has its silences, It's systems that future generations will unearth with horror. Remembering those who suffered under Viking captivity restores dignity to lives once erased and warns us against letting power strip humanity away again. If this history stirs you, subscribe and share in the comments what struck you most. We will confront the next buried truth together, because only by unearthing the forgotten can we guard against repeating it.